So less than half of the crimes that are committed are reported. And of those crimes that are reported, 10% are solved. That means about 5% of all crimes committed are solved. It's abysmal. In North Carolina, only 47.2% of violent victimizations were reported to the police, and only 41.6% of property victimizations were reported to the police. Over a quarter of the people who said, "I didn't report my crime to the police," was because they did not believe the police could or would do anything to help. At least 75% of felony convictions in North Carolina had a prior record of some sort. In the 2 years after prisoners were released, 44% of them were rearrested. For the total index offenses in 2023, there were 55,000 in the 11 counties that I cover as the Greater Triangle area. And out of those 55,000 cases, the total clearance rate, 11%. Less than half of murders are solved. If you get your vehicle stolen, there's only a 5% chance that they're identifying the culprit, clearing that crime. Hello and welcome to This Week in the Triangle. My name is Stephen Horn. I'm an independent journalist here in North Carolina. And this week we are talking about crime. This week we're going to really dive into some crime statistics, some crime thoughts, thinking about how we can look at crime. And this is really inspired by Trump's crime crackdown in DC, where he is bringing in federal personnel, the National Guard, to bring law and order to the streets of DC, which obviously has people quibbling about where DC exactly ranks among how bad it actually is. And so we're going to talk about some facts here, specifically relating to facts in North Carolina and in the Triangle area, the 11 counties that I cover here. So I think one flaw, one mistake that conservatives sometimes make when talking about crime is to attribute it too much to the police. Like, if you have a high crime rate, that must be because the police are doing a bad job. If you have a low crime rate, it's because the police are doing a good job. But let's be honest, Maine and New Hampshire do not have the lowest crime rates in the country because the police there are exceptionally good at doing their job. It's because of the people there. The essential role of police is to respond to crime. They investigate, they make arrests, they enforce the law, but they only have so much of an effect. There are two main ways that the police can actually deter crime, and one is by striking fear into the hearts of criminals, but the other way that they prevent crime is by keeping criminals segregated from the general population. If a criminal is in prison, during the time that he is in prison or jail, he is not committing any crimes against members of the general public. Creating a culture of fear for criminals, you can't rely on that to eliminate crime, because a lot of crime, especially violent crime, is not rational. Crimes like domestic violence, crimes like assault, crimes like a murder, if those are impulsive crimes, then putting some consequence in the future isn't necessarily going to stop the people. So we can't rely on vigorous policing to completely eliminate crime. But let's look at some data to see, are we close to that point where, adding more police isn't going to result in more safety, or are we very far from that point? So let's first start by talking about some of the limitations in measuring crime. When looking at the big picture point of view, we like to use statistics, like the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program. Police departments, law enforcement agencies, they report, these are the crimes that we come across. The FBI puts it all together so we can, have some kind of standardized comparison. But the inherent flaw here is that it's limited to crimes brought to the attention of law enforcement departments. And so the question is there different levels of crimes being reported in different departments? So the question is, what do those numbers actually look like? What percentage of crimes are actually reported to the police? That could be, a relatively small percentage of all crimes that are committed, or that could be pretty much all of the crimes that are committed. Well, there's another way that we measure crime, and that is through the National Crime Victimization Survey. That is by the Department of Justice. It's just what it sounds like from the title. They interview victims to say, hey, how many people are being victimized each year? The data from that indicates that less than half of all crimes are reported to the police. So in North Carolina, those numbers are for the period of 2020 to 2022, only 47.2% of violent victimizations were reported to the police, and only 41.6% of property victimizations were reported to the police. The question really is, does the attitudes, the practice, the policies of law enforcement influence whether crimes will be reported? So one thing the NCVS asks victims is, if you didn't report your crime, why didn't you report it? The percent of violent victimizations not reported to police by most important reason for not reporting, 2023. So the most common reason, above a quarter of them said that they dealt with it another way. But the second most common reason, police could not or would not do anything to help. We can put our thinking caps on, think a little logically. The people's trust in the police will influence that number. A pretty significant chunk of crimes that aren't reported, the police have some control over that. We can see that the trust in police likely has a pretty significant variance in what percentage of crimes get reported to the police. To follow on with that, let's get into some of the data on crime prevention through incarceration. Because like I mentioned earlier, criminals who are in prison or jail cannot commit crimes against members of the general public. How effective that is in preventing crimes is really what percentage of crimes are committed by repeat criminals versus what percentage are one-off. Someone commits a crime once, would never commit a crime for the rest of their life, then putting them in prison wouldn't lower the crime rate because they would never commit another crime. For here, I'm relying on some data from the North Carolina Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission for fiscal year 2019. The data here is that at least 75% of felony convictions in North Carolina had a prior record of some sort. If you have no prior convictions, you are in prior record level 1, and only 25% of the felony convictions were prior record level 1. So the vast majority of crime that people are being convicted for is crime committed by people who have a pattern of behavior. This isn't a one-off incident. This is most crime. So if you take someone who has a pattern of committing crime and you put them in prison or jail, for that period they are incarcerated, whatever pattern of crime they would engaged in against the general public, they are not able to do so, and that is a way we can expect vigorous policing to reduce the crime rate. We can look at it from the other point of view. Recidivism rates, the number of recidivist arrests in the 2 years after prisoners were released, 44% of them were rearrested. Think about that. 44%, and that's not lifetime recidivism, and that's not 44% committed crimes. That is 44% were caught. This reinforces the data regarding prior convictions is that a huge amount of the crime is committed by people who have a pattern of committing crime. And when those people are in prison, they're not committing crime against members of the general public. With that in mind, how do we know? Do we have enough police? Do we have too many police? Do we have just the right number of police? To answer that question, I would turn to clearance rates. The clearance rates basically means out of the crimes that police are aware of, how many of them are solved. That's kind of the rough way to think about that. Theoretically, if you have too few police, you would see that reflected in the clearance rates. They wouldn't be able to solve many crimes because they would have more on their plate than they could deal with, and we would also see a level of prioritization. So if the police don't have enough resources, what are they going to do? They're going to prioritize the most important crimes in regards to that, specifically in the Triangle area of North Carolina, which is where I focus on crime, where I focus on coverage. So this is the 2023 data. The latest data I could find, those released by the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigations, the clearance rate for certain index offenses. So basically they take a couple offenses and say, hey, we're going to track these for all the departments, release the clearance rates. So for the total index offenses in 2023, there were 55,000 in the 11 counties that I cover. The total clearance rate, 11%. 11%. To be fair, the most serious crime, homicide, has a much higher rate, 44%. And that is the highest clearance rate for any of these categories. If they're clearing less than half of murders, I would say that would be a clear indication we do not have enough police. If the most prioritized crime, they still can't get above a 50% solve rate, a 50% clearance rate. That seems to be a major problem. Perhaps the police could solve more crimes if they had more resources to investigate. And I think that is even more proof if we look at the drop off in clearance rates. So the clearance rate for murder, 44%. For rape, 12%. Robbery, 17%. Aggravated assault, 22%. Burglary, 11%. Larceny, 10%. And motor vehicle theft, 5%. 5%. If you get your vehicle stolen, there's only a 5% chance that they're identifying the culprit, clearing that crime. To me, looking at these statistics is, it's abysmal. It's abysmal. So less than half of the crimes that are committed are reported. And of those crimes that are reported, 10% are solved. That means about 5% of all crimes committed are solved. 5%. 5%. That's crazy. If they can increase the clearance rate by 5%, that's not just the number of crimes that they're solving. That's the number of crimes that they're preventing, because the same people who commit the crimes they're able to solve are also the people committing the crimes they aren't able to solve, the crimes that are unreported. That is the data we have. That is the extrapolation of the data we have. Most crimes, it appears, are committed by people who have a pattern of committing crimes. So if you're able to interrupt that pattern, imprison them, then they, through that period of imprisonment, they're not committing crimes against the general population. And I might be repeating myself, but that is for emphasis. That is to hammer the point home. I think these numbers are really important to understand. The crime numbers that we see is not just about the number of crimes that can tell you whether we need more police. I think the clearance rate is perhaps a much better indicator. Paradoxically, giving people trust that the police will actually investigate their crimes might look on paper like an increase in crime, just because people are more likely to report the crime that is happening. And that would be good if more people are reporting crimes. But it will look bad on paper because it will look like you have a higher crime rate. So once again, the numbers aren't everything. And yes, police vigorously enforcing the law, being active in arresting more criminals, even on seemingly minor offenses, if that results in more repeat criminals being in jail, being in prison, that will result in less crime for the law-abiding citizens who they would otherwise be victimizing.